This is a story of who we were, how we got here.
Houston, the Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility.
And where we are going.
You've got mail.
So join us as we take history off the page.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to History Off the Page. That was, of course, John Williams' iconic Imperial March from the Star Wars series. It's actually from Empire Strikes Back. It didn't appear in the original 1977 release New Hope, but we have become so used to hearing it that we immediately associate it with the Empire and with Star Wars, the dark side of the Force. You probably don't even have to close your eyes right now, and you can already imagine the scene. Hundreds of faceless stormtroopers lined up neatly into column after column after column. Ubiquitous Imperial officers who all seem to blend into one. Especially in the first three movies, they're all these kind of pasty British, they all kind of look the same. And all they're trying to do is seize power over the galaxy. In the later films, they start talking about, we're trying to restore some order to the galaxy. But really, it's just this vision of this kind of massless, faceless entity that's out there, and all they want to do is conquer just for the sake of acquiring power. Their idea of governance is not based upon these kind of enlightened ideals of, what are the will of the people? How are the people faring? Not even sort of even medieval ideas about kingship and justice and God, right? What are they there for? They're there for power. As Grand Moff Tarkin later says in one of the first movies, fear is what's going to keep the local systems in line, right? It is an image of government based on fear. This image is familiar to us not only because it was really well done in the original movies, obviously, but because it uses history as its model. When we think about the Empire in Star Wars, at least until recently, right, there's kind of postmodernism. What are the thoughts of the stormtroopers? They start telling it sort of from the other side. But basically, we see a modern projection of fascism. Again, think about the parallels, the lack of individuality amongst the stormtroopers and the Empire in general, the quest solely for power for its own sake, the lack of belief or concern for the value of life, the visual displays of order demonstrated through all those faceless columns marching, doing whatever they do. Why do stormtroopers wear armor? I've asked this question in a previous episode. What's the point? It's not to protect them because they get shot with lasers and they fall over. Isn't this a visual device to make them all seem like they have no individuality? There is no personhood in them. They just get letters and numbers for names. They don't actually have real names. And indeed, the term stormtrooper is actually borrowed directly from German history. These were the elite German soldiers from World War I, many of whom later got wrapped up in fascism and began forming the shock troops of Hitler's Nazi revolution. So part of what makes Star Wars so great, I would argue, is not the awful dialogue, right? You're going to Tashi Station to buy some power converters. It's really, really bad. And some of the acting, no offense, Mark Hamill, is pretty bad. But what makes it such a great movie is the contrast between the two sides of good and evil. And in this reading, the Empire is fascism. The rebels, on the other hand, are a projection of liberal democratic values, a movement that embraces individualism, freedom, diversity, tolerance, the value of life, and on and on and on. Now, for those of us who grew up in the 1980s, this contrast of good versus evil, fascism versus democracy, it seemed pretty distant from our own lives. Fascism was, of course, an ideology discredited by Hitler, and its totalitarian brother communism was discredited by the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. And yet, here we are 30 years later. And as I'm sure you're aware, people are talking a lot about fascism again these days. Not as something abstract or distant in a galaxy far, far away, to continue the Star Wars theme, but as something potentially on the immediate political horizon. And it's kind of interesting because this discourse transcends the political spectrum. You'll find people talking about fascism and a fear of fascism on the left, of course, but you'll also find it on the right. You'll find it here in the United States, but you'll also find it in parts of Europe. This sense that we are entering a phase of history where all of a sudden autocracy is coming back, the idea of one individual invested with massive amounts of power. You don't like the idea of the individual, if you want to say one government invested with massive amounts of power, and slowly our individuality slipping away, our freedom of choice, our ability to say, I want to do X, I want to be different. There is this global moment of anxiety that again transcends political, ideological, cultural, geographical boundaries. And that to me is fascinating. Now, to some extent, this sentiment is historically understandable. The generation that grew up in the 1980s never thought we could get to this place. We grew up in a world defined by optimism and certainty. We thought we understood the times that not just we were living through, but that we would eventually live through. We had witnessed not only the fall of communism, but also apartheid. Peace seemed to be at hand in the Middle East. And for the first time in living memory, 3 generations, there seemed to be consensus about what the future of the world would look like. Democracy, capitalism, classic liberalism, the latter being understood as a society based on the rule of law and natural rights. These seem to be the foundations of the future world that we would inhabit. And of course, a great example of this way of thinking is the classic book by the philosopher Francis Fukuyama called The End of History and the Last Man from 1992. He has an earlier essay where he kind of teases out some of these ideas, and then he wrote a book in 1992 that kind of made this argument. Capitalism, liberal democracy, this is the future. This is the winner of the great ideological struggles. And yet, what has the 21st century brought us? In both the United States and Europe, the answer has often been disenchantment. Time and time again, it seems authorities and elites have failed the people that they are supposed to look after. Looking at American history, people don't seem to think that the tax cuts and deregulation have produced widespread wealth. Instead, critics will contend that much of that has gone to elites. Whether you tend to think of the elite as being the kind of upper class, the 1%, right? That's the elites. Or whether you think about them in a kind of geographical or cultural sense. Who's benefited from globalization? It's not the working class guy from Scranton, Pennsylvania. It's the urban elites, the coastal dwellers, people that live in New York or LA. If you live in flyover country, you've been kind of forgotten about. You never experienced the benefits, is how a lot of people feel. Think about all the experts who told us the Iraq War would be easy, and to some extent Afghanistan, that we would be greeted as liberators, and that the war would usher in a new American century. All of these predictions were horribly, horribly wrong, and they were made by the quote-unquote experts. Instead, we got a decade of war, suffering, and frustration. But it's not all about politics. The super smart guys from the Ivy Leagues that ran Wall Street told us the best way to manage our money, and then watched as we lost it again and again in stock market bubbles, and then in the Great Recession. Main Street paid the price for their credit default swaps, while big banks got bailed out because they were just too big to fail. And at the highest levels, democratic politics itself seems to have led only to paralysis. regardless of your political leanings. It is undeniable that major issues such as illegal immigration, mass shootings, and climate change have not been addressed. Rather than producing solutions, what we get instead is politicians grandstanding and gaslighting and posturing. Like wrestling characters from the WWE, they have become very good at giving performances and very poor at the actual idea of governing. The story, by the way, is pretty similar in Europe, where one could add to this list the failures and complications of things like Brexit. Brexit was supposed to usher in this new golden age of British self-sufficiency and all this money that would be freed up. And, it was going to be great. Not so much. You could add to that list responses to the 2015 Syrian migrant crisis. And then, of course, more globally speaking, we have COVID, where the government and its experts struggle to deal with the coronavirus pandemic, shifting guidelines, being inconsistent in applying lockdowns, sometimes ignoring their own restrictions. So many stories of politicians telling everyone to stay home because it's not safe, and then they're out at a fancy restaurant, they're at the salon. Plenty of examples of hypocrisy during COVID. And so at the end of all this turbulence, we find ourselves living through a time of instability and uncertainty, a time when faith in democratic institutions has waned, when they no longer seem to persist, a time when the specter of change through violence has once again returned. I start off with this long summary of events that you're living through. Probably some of you are like, Dr. Hansen, I know all this. I'm alive right now. I can see what's going on. But I bring this up because basically, we've been here before. In the 1920s, the world was beset by disenchantment with traditional authorities. This was a time, as we've seen in the last 5 episodes of our podcast, a time of dramatic cultural and social change, a time of political uncertainty, a time of fear and anxiety when the threat of communism was lived experience in many countries. And that time produced, as we'll see, beginning in today's episode, the phenomenon we now call fascism. Now, even though I've obviously touched on some political things just a moment ago, again, this isn't meant to be a political podcast. I don't want to get into labeling various contemporary political groups as fascist or not fascist. Again, as I said, the anxiety is out there. It transcends the political spectrum. You can read plenty of people accusing other people of being fascists. I'm not going to give my own opinion on this right now, maybe at some other time or place. But as I said, interest in and fear of the return of fascism is quite strong. And so I think as we talk about these things in public life, and maybe sometimes it is appropriate to talk about them, I think it's important as we do this, though, to have an understanding of what is actually fascism. How did fascism actually come about? It's not just, there was a bad man in Austria who then lived in Germany, and then he just kind of hypnotized everyone, and fascists are just bad. Darth Vader doesn't exist. The Emperor Palpatine from Star Wars, they're caricatures. This isn't how fascism really starts, where you just happen to have a bad guy and he's just evil, and there's just hundreds of thousands of nameless, faceless people that are going to follow them. Fascism was a historical movement, and so we need to understand its historical context in order to be able to talk about it today. To understand what exactly fascism was and why people turned to it in such large numbers, that is what we are going to start talking about with this podcast and the next several in this series. I hope you'll find this discussion informative, and feel free to post or email me questions if you have some. You can either do this through my direct email address, which is available on www.historyoffthepage.com. You can just click on the contact link. Or if you're using Spotify, there's a space now in Spotify at the bottom to be able to submit questions and answers. So I'll try to respond to those as best I can. If you're on Spotify, feel free to post them. Okay, enough about the preamble. Let's begin by talking about what fascism is, and then we'll get into the history, specifically in Italy. Now, fascism is actually notoriously hard to define. And if you just Googled what is fascism, you can get a whole bunch of different takes on it from various scholars, various public authorities, because it's not unlike communism. It doesn't really have a clear set of canon, a clear set of doctrine. In other words, if I said, you want to learn something about communism, what should you do? Well, you should probably pick up your Karl Marx and start reading Marx, Lenin, other intellectuals, Mao, right? Read their readings, because communism is a very philosophical, or it's a very intellectual movement at its base, right? Ideologically, it's flushed out, their theories, dialectical materialism, all that fun stuff. Fascists never really do that. There are some fascist intellectuals. There is an Alfred Rosenberg out there. Mussolini does write a kind of an essay on what is fascism. But fascism is better understood as more of an organic movement, an organic reaction to communism, than it is something that is really well thought out, well structured. It's kind of ironic, considering that if you think about what fascism designs to be, right, to have a kind of almost totalitarian state, that the ideological underpinnings of fascism are actually fairly loose. And we'll see this in a little bit when we talk about Mussolini, and how Mussolini is, even though he's not really someone who wants to be a socialist after 1915, more or less, there's still a lot of aspects of socialism that he likes. So it seems kind of weird to say that, right? How can you be a fascist and a socialist at the same time? But we'll see that there's a lot of room for interpretation, a lot of flexibility built into fascism, especially in its early stages. But fascism isn't just a response to the threat of communism. It is also a response to the perceived failures of the liberal democracies. A lot of the appeal of fascism and its radicalism is tied to the notion that contemporary governments, contemporary authorities, traditional authorities, these are weak, these are corrupt, these are ineffective, they're impotent, and they're not capable of responding to the challenge of communism. So it's not just that there's a threat of communism out there, but again, it's this kind of cynicism about the ability of liberal democracy to withstand the challenge of communism. Fascists tend to emphasize radicalism. They want to break or exceed existing norms about what is politically or socially acceptable. The rule of law, the long-standing aversion to violence in Western politics since at least the French Revolution, were seen as secondary to the more existential question of defeating communism. To put this another way, a fascist would argue that these liberal sensibilities are what kept liberalism from stopping communism. The rule of law is not a pillar of strength for a democratic society. It is actually the fatal flaw that allows it to be overthrown. To kind of use an American example, how can you let a criminal go just because the police officer did not read him or her their Miranda rights? How can you let a technical mistake in the process of a court case, how can you let a child rapist off, or a child murderer, or something, completely heinous? How can you let these communist guys sit around and plot, and then they just say, well, it's freedom of speech, freedom of assembly? Right? These are obviously the language I'm using is an American way of telling the story, but basically the point is the same, right? Law is what criminals hide behind rather than something that protects our freedom. This is how many fascists would have understood the question. Instead, what fascists long for is a world in which a strong, centralized, and national government would focus the attention of its people on the thing that mattered most, which was the survival of the national community. To do this most effectively, power should be concentrated in the hands of a single individual, whose providence would guide to achieve the most favorable results. This leader, Il Duce in Italian, the Führer in German, Poglavnik in Croatia, this leader exercised complete control and often oversaw the establishment of a cult of personality around themselves. Basically, this is the kind of big bad daddy model of governance, right? If we have problems in society, we don't want discussions. We don't want these kind of rule of law getting in the way. What we need is a superhero, an uber father who will kind of come in, knock some heads together, and restore order. This is the vision that fascists have and yearn for in the 1920s. Finally, the last major component of defining fascism is that it focused on the idea of national community, often defined by racial or genetic factors. In other words, whereas today most of us would say, if you want to become an American, if you want to become French or even German or Polish, you can do so. Whether that's through being born in those countries, whether that's through a process of naturalization, once you go and live there, you apply for a passport. Today you can actually buy passports in certain European countries. Fascists understand the nation not as this kind of political unit of will, but as an organic community that is formed naturally and immediately at birth. Basically, the fascists understand it as a body, right? You're born into it. Your body, your cells can't change their nature. They also would argue then that all loyalty should be given to the national unit, not the individual. If you have to sacrifice your life for the good of the nation, then that is something that we should celebrate. That is something that you should celebrate, that you should be willing to do. Whether we're talking here about a military sacrifice, I'm willing to go out and die on the battlefield for the glory of Italy, or whether we're talking more about sort of our life choices. What is the purpose of a woman in a fascist society? A fascist would say it's to have children. Women are the way that the nation replicates itself, and so they want to have as many babies as possible. Again, the metaphor of a body works out really well here. Your body has in it cells whose sole purpose is to die. Whether you're talking about nail or hair cells, right? They exist literally to die, to become strong, and to help protect your body. Whether you're talking about white blood cells, whether you're talking about the various parts of your body, the individuality of your cells don't matter. In fact, what do we call cells that are not thinking about your body? Aren't those cancerous? And so again, from the fascist perspective, the only thing that matters is the national well-being, and law can become an impediment to achieving this. And even where there were abuses of law, where you say, well, wait a minute, this person didn't get a trial. Turns out they weren't actually a communist. How much does their individual life matter if all we're talking about here is the survival of the nation as a whole? If some of those cells died that didn't need to die, it was a mistake, so what? If you bite your tongue and, swallow a little bit of tongue cells or something like that, you're still going to live. The world goes on. And so again, this is why fascism is so different than liberal democracy. Like communism, it kind of sees the world moving through these larger social forces, and individual lives don't really matter as much. Now, traditionally, fascism has often been understood as an ideology of the right. And this is especially because of this emphasis on, again, the nation, on the safeguarding of the traditional body politic, from the left-wing radicalism of communism or socialism. However, there are some academics out there who would argue that this left-right dichotomy is actually quite problematic, and that the better way to understand both communism and fascism is through the lens of totalitarianism, i.e. the notion that regardless of their ideological base, both fascism and communism tended to share a lot of similarities in terms of governance. They both centralize power, often under a single individual, or in the case of communism, under a small group of individuals. They both regard individuals outside of the party as unimportant. They celebrated the use of violence as a key tool to solve social problems. They dominated and infected, and in some cases destroyed, institutions of civic society so that there was no life beyond the party. Now, the key name who first kind of advances this theory was the German philosopher Hannah Arendt. And just to lay my cards on the table, I'll admit that I am largely sympathetic to her argument. There are others who are critical of it. It's fine. We can disagree about things. But to my mind, the way that I have kind of read the historical evidence is that there is an awful lot of similarities between communism and fascism. And even though the ideologies may be very different, in practice, the way that they are used tends to be very similar. And this is especially true when we're talking about notions of power. For both communism and for fascism, the idea of centralizing power becomes such a huge part of what happens in the Soviet Union, in Nazi Germany, and also, as we'll see, in Italy. Okay, so we're 20-some minutes into this podcast, and you're saying, where's the Italy? I thought you were going to talk about Mussolini. So let's get into some actual history. Fascism, even though we tend in the United States to think about it more in terms of Nazi Germany, fascism is actually, one could say, invented in Italy in the course of the 1920s, and it is kind of a direct reaction to some specific circumstances related to Italian history. The big name associated with it is obviously Benito Mussolini. How much he invents this versus how much he kind of inherits it, it's a matter of perspective, it's a matter of debate. But he is the first leader that fascism really comes together in and who deploys these concepts successfully. Now, I know we haven't really talked a lot about Italian history in the course of this podcast, and I do apologize for that. I would like to go back and talk about some of these things in more detail. But for our purposes, we just want to start very briefly with the idea of Italian unification. And what you need to understand about Italian history is that on the verge of World War I, Italy was still a country, one could say, that was wrestling with the onset of modernity. And there's a variety of ways that this was experienced, first and foremost through the idea of national unity, which, despite unification, had largely not been achieved by the time that World War I starts. There is, of course, this very famous quote by the Italian statesman Massimo d'Azeglio, who wrote that having made Italy, it was now time to make Italians. And for 2 generations, the Italian state basically tries to do this. And it uses the same techniques that we're seeing in places like France, places like England, right? How do we learn our nationalism? If you go back and listen to my podcast episode on the beginnings of nationalism, rise of national identity, one of the big things that they used was something like universal primary education. How do you come to realize your own belonging? How do you come in the United States to think about yourself as being American? Do you not, every morning in school, literally take a pledge to the nation? Another strategy to bind people together and help them develop national consciousness that we talked about was transportation networks. And so, of course, in the latter half of the 19th century, the Italian government is building roads. It is building bridges. It is increasing railroad usage. It's trying to bind together the various peoples and get them to move around and start to think about themselves as Italian. By 1919, however, these efforts had mostly failed. Industrialization actually exacerbates the historical gap between the industrial North and the agrarian South. In this environment, regional identities and loyalties continued to persist, as did religious disagreement over the role of the Pope and Catholicism in the modern secular state. Again, we didn't really have a chance to go into this, but one of the key things that allows the formation of Italy in 1870 is the Franco-Prussian War, when the rest of Italy can attack and defeat the Pope and occupy the Papal States. Finally, the industrialization of the North and the adoption of modern production techniques by companies like Fiat created a large working-class movement that favored socialism and communism. The class divide in Italy therefore took on regional dimensions as well. And in the turbulent life of a 19th century capitalist society, with its economic booms and busts, you have a recipe here for a great deal of disappointment. In a surprise to many Italian liberals, unified Italy does not wrap itself in glory after 1870. Indeed, the Italian state is so divided, so frustrated, that militarily, where in a period when you have massive colonial expansion, you have the Germans, the British, the French, the English, the Portuguese, the Belgians, everybody's racing around, carving up Africa, carving up parts of Asia. Italy is humiliated by the Ethiopians at the Battle of Adwa in 1896. It is the first major example of a European power losing a battle or a war to a kind of quote-unquote backwards society that they really shouldn't be losing to if Europe is all that more progressive, all that more advanced, all that more sophisticated. So again, on the eve of World War I, Italy is divided, Italians are frustrated, they're disappointed. And the antidote to this situation of malaise many Italian politicians imagined in 1914 was participation in the Great War. The war, they hoped, would rally Italians to the national cause, awakening in them a sense of patriotism that would transcend local identities. At the same time, it would also open a new glorious chapter in Italian history, when the nation would finally be made whole, even expanding its colonial domains to take its place alongside the great powers of Europe. Italy thus began negotiating with Britain and France, even though they were technically allies of Germany and Austria-Hungary, leading to the secret Treaty of London. In exchange for joining the Entente side, Italy would receive Trentino, South Tyrol, and large sections of Dalmatia. So basically, Italians would say, well, we haven't really created real Italy yet in 1870. We got close. We've got most of it. But there are a couple Italian speakers, a couple historically Italian places that are still outside of Italy. And so when Italy enters the war in late May 1915, the liberal presses celebrate the moment with exuberant enthusiasm. This is the beginning of a brand new chapter of Italian history when we will wrap ourselves in glory. We will complete the mission of our fathers. The war will be short, glorious, and beneficial. Crowds gather in major cities to celebrate the event, again with this expectation that Italy would quickly triumph. This enthusiasm, of course, was badly misplaced. You think about World War I, there are a number of examples of complete failures. There is obviously a lot of going over the top and kind of, especially on the Western Front, millions of men just being mowed down by machine guns, the offensive weapons, the tactics, way behind the defensive ones. But in an era when many armies fail, Italian failure is among the most egregious, among the most complete. Italy falters badly right from the start. Their initial offensive operations grind down, are totally unsuccessful. They will spend 3 years and go through at least, I believe, 12 battles at the Isonzo front, trying to slowly push into what is modern-day Slovenia. There are a couple reasons that Italy struggles so much, beyond just the kind of basic reasons, one of which is morale. Unlike most of the other combatants, Italians did not possess a strong sense of national identity, as we talked about. They have regional identities, class, religious, lots of other hats that they wear, but what it actually meant to them to be Italian, for many Italians, it doesn't mean a whole heck of a lot. Now, another problem they have is that the Italian government does not clearly communicate with the population as to why they are fighting. What is the big goal? Right? The Treaty of London is secret. We can't just come out and say, oh, we're fighting to go annex a bunch of territory. So why are we fighting in this war? Why are we sacrificing the lives of tens and potentially hundreds of thousands of Italian soldiers? Why did we just betray our allies in Germany and Austria? Catholics and socialists also have some issues with the war. Right? Catholics would say, wait a minute. Austrians are Catholic, we're Catholic, why are we shooting each other? Socialists would say something similar, but based on class. Why would workers go out and shoot themselves or shoot each other? Shouldn't they focus on the class struggle? Finally, the Italian army is just not that strong to begin with. We mentioned they are defeated by Ethiopia in 1896. They come back and try a little bit later in Libya in 1913. They do have some limited successes there, but there's no great tradition of Italian conquest. There's no Italian Napoleon in 1914 or 1915. So poorly armed and not properly motivated, the Italian army fails miserably on the battlefield. As I mentioned, over the course of 2.5 years, they struggle to move several dozen kilometers up the Isonzo River, which is in the western part of Slovenia. Finally, in October of 1917, at the Battle of Caporetto, they experience a dramatic defeat. Basically, the Austro-Hungarians get some reinforcements from Germany, and together they exploit a weak point in the Italian lines. They break through, and by November, Italy has suffered over 900,000 casualties, and German and Austro-Hungarian troops are threatening Venice. Now, military disaster doesn't always mean collapse, right? It doesn't always mean that the nation is falling apart. Quite the opposite, it can often serve as a rallying point. If you look at the early history of the French Revolution, what is the key moment that rallies the nation to the cause? It is the invasion of the Prussian forces, which culminates then in the French victory at the Battle of Valmy. But coming into that, before that, it looks like things are really bad. We're in a lot of trouble. Think about American history in the Alamo. Is it not the Mexican forces doing so well, defeating the American garrison basically at the Alamo? Is that not what then sparks people to rally to the flag and enables them in some ways to defeat Santa Anna later on? So when the Battle of Caporetto happens, there are several Italians who think this is going to be a moment for national renewal. This suffering that is experienced is not a catastrophe in and of itself if it can be linked to a higher purpose. Suffering might be a necessary step in the path towards greater unity. It might be a motivational moment. It might inspire increased dedication and commitment to the national cause. I'm recording this on September 14th, 2023. We just commemorated the 22nd anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. As someone who was in New York that day, who remembers very well the spirit of not just 9/11, but the days afterwards, how did many Americans feel after 9/11? Right? We were sad. It was a tragedy. But it also awakened feelings of patriotism that might otherwise have been dormant. Now, obviously, there are people who look at Caporetto and say, okay, this is not just a moment to come together. This is a clear sign of how badly the liberal government has been governing. This is an indication that the liberal politicians and political institutions have made an enormous mistake by getting us involved into World War I. So basically, the defeat at Caporetto, it doesn't make Italians feel one way or the other, but it radicalizes their opinions. There is less desire for tolerance, for moderation, for discussion, and a feeling like this time of absolutes is coming. This time for choosing, to use another phrase from American history, is coming. Caporetto, as one future fascist wrote, should inspire Italians to dedicate themselves to, quote, killing, 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 end quote. They must accept that their, quote, men, fathers, husbands, brothers, lovers, sons, die, end quote, to achieve a holy massacre of the barbarian, quote, a butchering of the aggressor, a shambles of the race of prey, end quote. Notice the violence and extremism of the language here from Paolo Orano, which both normalizes death and dehumanizes the enemy from the battlefield. These themes, dehumanization, normalizing death, these are common tropes in fascist and proto-fascist literature. And so in the fascist mindset, rechristened in this new purpose, Italy would then achieve success that it had so far lacked. Now, another element that follows from Caporetto, again, I talked about this sort of radicalization. One of the big things that happens is we start to say, It's not just that there are external enemies out there. Italians are strong. They can only explain defeat not just as having lost to external forces, but we must have internal enemies as well. And perhaps the time has come to deal with these internal enemies. People like the socialists who have opposed the war, who have undermined morale, who have been constantly trying to work against the nationalist spirit, that if it all comes together, will bring everyone together and rally Italy, and now we're on our path to national glory. In popular right-wing presses, socialists and communists now become derided not just as people who disagree with us, Italians of a different political persuasion, but as, quote, agents of defeat, end quote, who were doing the work of the Germans for them. What's going on here is you are beginning to delegitimize political opposition. It is, again, not that someone disagrees with you about policy or tactics. It is that they are a traitor. They are traitors to the nation, and you do not have to recognize them or their opinions as legitimate. Now, a lot of this is going on intellectually. It's going on kind of behind the scenes, at kind of coffee houses and things like that. It's going on also on the front lines in conversations between individual soldiers. But in the end, the Italian army does manage to stabilize the front at Piave. And about a year later, in October 1918, they finally break the Austro-Hungarians at the Battle of Vittorio Veneto. But the damage was done. Men and women who had long thought of themselves as national liberals began to abandon their faith in liberalism and democracy. The rule of law no longer seemed to matter compared to the existential challenges facing the country. The war had provided a model for what a unified Italy could look like. What was missing was a savior, a decisive leader who could bring glory to the nation by crushing its internal and external enemies. Now, we'll get into who that savior was in just a moment. But first, I want to continue this thought about what Italy was like in the immediate post-war period and how that provided an incubator for early fascist sentiments. Because as frustrated as Italians were with their performance during the war, one could argue that their post-war experiences were just as disappointing. To begin with, although Italy had emerged on the winning side of the war, they never actually got the big glorious payoff that they expected. Instead, Woodrow Wilson and his calls for national self-determination limit Italian gains, especially in Dalmatia, where you have a lot of Slavic-speaking Slovenes and Croats. In particular, Italians were frustrated by their exclusion from the port city of Fiume, which is today known as Rijeka. Italy did not expand its colonial empire. Instead, it was forced to watch Britain and France expand theirs. And at one point, actually, the lead Italian negotiator, Vittorio Orlando, he's in a quarrel with the French and the British about the ways to proceed, right? The Americans are there as well. And he says, I don't like this. I'm leaving. You can't do anything without me. And so he kind of goes back to Italy and hopes that they'll come begging. Oh, no, okay, we'll give in to you. We care about you. Well, what happens? The other great powers go, oh, great, the Italians are gone. Now we can get things done more easily. And so Orlando kind of has to come back with his kind of tail between his legs. And the Italians are humiliated. They realize we are not being treated as if we are on the same level as the United States, Britain, or France. Now, to make matters even worse, you don't just have diplomatic or political humiliation, but as we've talked about, Europe in 1919 is a mess, and Italy is no different. There is a wave of inflation that strikes in the summer of 1919. Unemployment skyrockets, right? What happens when the war is over? Well, suddenly all these men that were soldiers come back. They want jobs. The cherry on top, if you will, of what not to do is provided by the Italian prime minister of the moment, Francesco Nitti, who has a brilliant quote. The people are upset. There's unemployment. There's inflation. What should we do? He says, well, Italians should produce more and consume less. Great words of advice there, right? If you're a politician, times are not going well, people are unhappy, tell them to work harder and stop whining. Now, of course, as this is all going on, all this turmoil and crisis, in this environment, the other big development, of course, is that all across Europe, we see an explosion of popularity from socialist parties. Whether you're talking about just the parties themselves growing, or you're talking about places like Russia, places like Hungary, places like Bavaria, where there are actually socialists and communists that take power. In Italy, it was more of the former, where the number of socialists in parliament trebles in the November 1919 parliamentary elections. And while today, of course, we're used to this happening on a regular basis, we say, okay, this party gained some seats, this party lost some seats. Remember, in 1919, there isn't a long history of socialism as a political movement. Socialism as a movement that works within the existing political framework of democracy. Many socialists in 1919 are not talking about adjustments to the marginal tax rate. They're talking about land redistribution. They're talking about taking over factories, nationalizing industry, even full-blown communism. So owner-worker relations in the middle of all of this economic turbulence by the early 20s get really heated. And of course, the workers themselves are also pissed off, right? Inflation, as we've seen in our own day, hurts ordinary people. And so if the boss isn't going to give you a raise, how are you going to survive? So, for example, in 1920, a series of strikes in March gets followed by mass lockouts, leading workers to occupy the factories in September. In the countryside, you have repeated examples in 1919 and somewhat in 1920 of peasants who will seize the land from their landlords. So there is a lot of violence in Italy in this moment, and the liberal government, the democratic government does not seem capable of dealing with it. So if you're not a socialist and you're concerned and you're watching the world kind of go to hell, what do you do? The liberal parties don't seem to be particularly effective, but you can't just stand back and watch as society burns, can you? So for a significant number of Italian nationalists, the answer is no. The answer is to begin to take matters into your own hands. The rule of law is nice. The army is nice. The police are nice. We're very lucky to have people who serve in those institutions. But if the army or the police are not effective enough to deal with the crisis, don't we just have to take matters into our own hands? And so it's in this moment, in this climate, that you start to see at the local level the formation of the first fasci di combattimento, which are these sort of small cells or groups or gangs. They're mostly men. And as I said, they basically say we're going to take matters into our own hands. Sometimes you hear them referred to in history as squadrists. This means, again, you get a little group of guys together, you get some guns, and you're going to go and take care of the problem. You're not going to wait for the rule of law. You're not going to deal with trials or the police. You become the law yourself. And in practice, of course, this means using violence. You say, here is this socialist organizer. I'm not going to go protest. I'm not going to go complain about him. I'm going to go to his house and beat him up in front of his wife and kids. In April of 1919, for example, a group of fascists in Milan get together and attack the offices of Mussolini's former socialist paper, Avanti. We don't like the socialists. What do? We're going to go in and we're going to vandalize their property. We're going to take those printing presses and literally destroy them so that we don't have to put up with their poison that they're pumping into the atmosphere. Another example of this comes from 1921, squadrists from the town of Florence drive out to a small neighboring village called Empoli. There was a group of sailors who accidentally wound up in Empoli. They were not there for any political purposes, but they're perceived that way from some of the working class groups, and so they get attacked, they're beaten up. And so these guys from Florence are like, well, no, we're not going to put up with that. We're not going to allow that to happen. And so they roll into Empoli, and they begin what they refer to as a cleansing action. They start beating and intimidating the local communists, find the ringleader, make them drink a thing of castor oil. You start to send a message, and you do it through the use of violence. There are even examples of assassinations, kidnapping members of your opponent's family. So again, you send the message not to try that in the particular town that they're talking about. Now, we should take a moment to develop our understanding of who these men were a bit more, because it's easy to fall into stereotypes about the left and right. If you lean to the left, if you define yourself as progressive or socialist or even communist, right? Who are these men? Oh, they must be reactionaries. They must be authoritarians. Of course, you'd say that fascists now, but in this point, fascism is just kind of embryonic. So we don't want to get lost in these stereotypes. Let's talk about who these guys actually were. What we can say about them is that the men of 1919 in Italy are a little bit more complicated than the politics, the labels that we tend to use today. They don't really have, as I said, a rigid ideology. There is no Karl Marx, there's no St. Peter or Paul, there's no Nicene Council. Instead, what we tend to get are values and sort of perspectives. And so one of the biggest values that, of course, all of these guys have, many of whom are former soldiers, demobilized veterans from the war, or another big subgroup are people that are teenagers during the war. So you're 14 in 1918, 14 in 1917. You're not old enough to actually fight, but you want to, and you're denied that opportunity. And so joining a squadrist group, becoming a fascist, this becomes a way of achieving that. So again, we can say that basically most of these guys are interested in the nation. They feel patriotic, like they love the nation. A second component of what many of them believe is that they have this sort of disenchantment with existing authorities and politics. Before World War I begins, you have a number of prominent fascists who are actually socialists. You say, well, that's weird. What made them transfer from one to the other? Well, both fascism and socialism, or communism in this case, both of them share this kind of dislike of existing authorities, institutions, conditions. Both socialism and fascism kind of say we have to have revolutionary change in order to secure the future. Now, in terms of policy, there aren't really clear policies for fascism as they are in socialism. You think about socialists, what do socialists want? Well, they want a certain cap on wages. They want to nationalize industry. Many times they'll want to create a people's militia instead of having an army, which is usually dominated by the upper classes. Fascists don't really have a prescribed set of programs. And in fact, in many cases, even though they hate socialists, they like the programs that the socialists are selling. They like the idea of an 8-hour workday, of a minimum wage. Italian fascists actually proposed that aristocrats who leave land uncultivated should have it seized by the state and redistributed to the poor. That sounds pretty Marxist-Leninist to me. But it didn't strike them as a contradiction because fascism is not about the size of government. Fascism is about centralizing power and revolutionary change. You go and look at the early history of the Nazi Party, you'll find there's an awful lot in there about the problems of interest. Early Nazism is very anti-capitalist. They don't like the idea that people are making money through the stock market, through banks, through interest rates and money lending. Now, they moderate on that, and we'll talk about that more in a future podcast. But again, it's worth noting, especially the early 20s, the idea of revolution, the idea of dramatic change to society, this pervades both the fascist and communist movements. So again, how do we square this seeming contradiction? A big part of the answer, in my opinion, is that fascism is, again, not about ideology so much as it is about the idea of power. The idea of centralizing power in an authority figure, yes, but even below that, as an individual, I'd argue that much of it is really about power and masculinity. The idea that in the modern world, when I as an individual am so beset by so many cultural forces, economic forces, social forces, these big things that I can't control, immigration, recession. When it seems like I'm drowning, how can I regain control of the world around me? And so I would actually argue that a core component of fascism is this idea that by everybody coming together, everybody joining in the name of the nation to work for the national good, it is a way of kind of seizing control over your kind of larger existence. Historians refer to this as the idea of agency, the idea that I control my own destiny. And people in 1919, 1920 in Italy and other parts of Europe, they feel like they're losing their control over their own futures. And so by becoming fascists, by uniting together, they're kind of saying, look, I am going to take back control of my life. Those of you that are living in Britain and that were around during the Brexit campaign in 2015, 2016, you'll recognize that slogan, take back control. It is a fantastically effective slogan for mobilizing people, especially in the modern world when we often feel like we're just kind of overcome by events or by larger forces. So another thing that's related to this when you look at studies of fascism is that they tend to be hyper-masculine. Fascist men tend to prize strength, assertiveness, determination, sexual prowess. They love the idea of action, that rather than reacting to the world around you, being passive, being effeminate, you embrace the idea of willpower. You make the world what you want it to be. And you do that not through intrigue or invention or calculus or strategy. You don't do it by being a thinking man. You do it by the sheer force of will. You often do it by violence, I might add. These are not tropes that we're unfamiliar with in early 21st century American and European society. How does someone like Iron Man, someone like Thor, how do the Marvel heroes, how do these people win the fights that they're in? Is it not often through sheer force of will? Go back and look at the Batman Begins movie from, I think it's like 2005 or 2006. It kind of rebooted Batman. And there's this whole thing there about Batman is screwing up, he's suffering, he's weak, and he needs to train his mind in order to conquer the world or in order to overcome bad guys, essentially. Right? He's got to master violence and self-discipline. In fact, the Batman analogy is really helpful here because for Batman, violence is not something to be feared. It is something to be embraced or mastered. By using violence, one can create social harmony through the elimination or intimidation of enemies. This is at the core of fascism, but it's also a kind of running current through American and European culture as well, right? Through being the badass sheriff who maybe pushes the boundaries just a little bit, you can break the criminal gangs and restore order. Now, legitimating the use of violence is a bit tricky, right? I just mentioned that we have tropes of it in European and American society where it's looked at as a good thing, but there are also plenty of examples where it is taboo. And so as a result, how do you legitimate the use of violence? One technique that was very popular in the 1920s is to dehumanize and brutalize your opposition. You have to portray your rivals, Again, not as wrong or incorrect or just, they're well-meaning, but they're just, they don't quite get it. You have to portray them as a threat to the national good. And this is why, if you look at any fascist society, language is so, so important, because language helps shape the mentality of the people who follow it. Many of you, of course, will be familiar with George Orwell's famous novel 1984, which is basically about a totalitarian society, whether you want to call them communist or socialist or fascist. Doesn't really matter, right? They're kind of all very similar. But language in Orwell's 1984 is so important to the point that you have an entire ministry whose job it is to clean up and police the usage of language. Don't like the fictional example? Go and look at the work of a German professor named Victor Klemperer. Klemperer was a baptized Jew who survived World War II. He actually kept these fantastic diaries that, again, somehow survived the firebombing of Dresden. After the war, he wrote a book called Lingua Tertii Imperii, or Language of the Third Reich. And it basically goes through why the Germans are using the words that they're using and how that is shaping the mentality of the people that were using them. There is also, in addition to this focus on masculinity and on this legitimation of violence, a kind of nihilism that kind of works its way through early fascist writings as well. It's this idea that even if our destruction, even if our revolution fails, that at least in destroying the kind of rotten corpus that's around us and in tearing down all of these edifices and buildings that are no longer valid, we will at least provide a space for something new and healthy to grow organically in its place. As the Italian fascist Italo Balbo remarked, quote, better to deny all, destroy all, renew all from the base, end quote. Finally, one last thing about fascism that helps make it appealing that we should mention is this idea that people like to be a part of something larger than themselves. Let's face it, most people have jobs, they go to work, they come home, they make dinner, they have kids maybe, they raise the kids. A lot of life is kind of moving on what my wife likes to call the treadmill. A lot of life is just doing these menial tasks to make it through each day. And that's pretty boring. That makes us feel pretty insignificant. We feel like a psychological strain from that. But somewhere deep down inside, we have this desire to be a part of something bigger than ourselves. We want our lives to have meaning. I think here of the title of Rick Warren's book, The Purpose-Driven Life, right? Which is about taking your life and making it dedicated to God, giving it a reason beyond just, I'm trying to get through the day, which again is kind of psychologically depressing. We have this desire to leave the world a better place than we found it, or at least to have some kind of lasting mark upon it. And so as people are living through this moment of crisis and uncertainty in 1919, 1920, 21, fascism is a way to give your life purpose. If you are unemployed, fascism, and to some extent communism as well, is a way to give your life meaning, to find something to do with your everyday. Go and brawl with people, fight the fight, do something good on behalf of not yourself, but on behalf of the nation as a whole. Let me bring all these threads together then with an illustrative quote from a young fascist in 1919. For us, the fascist wrote, the great conflict, meaning the war, isn't over. Where there were external enemies, now there are internal foes. On one side, real Italians, lovers of their country. On the other, their enemies, the cowards who seek to blow to pieces our national grandeur. Direct action is needed against them, energetic, decisive, courageous action. And we, the interventionists of the first hour, must accept this sacred task. So much going on in that quote there, right? Taking the idea, the mobilization, the polarization of the war, where there's Italians and there's the enemies, and transposing it to domestic politics. The idea of action, of taking control of the situation, of not saying, well, let's wait till the next census, let's wait till the next election, let's wait till the next, discussion group, but saying we have to do this and we can do it and we will do it now. And finally, of course, just that one last part about the sacrality of the task at hand. This is not just ordinary politics. It's not just about, I'm doing this for my self-interest, or maybe my tax rate will go down, or maybe this particular policy that I like will be achieved. No, this is not about me as an individual. It is sacred. It is up there with the most important tasks that any man or woman can be involved with. This is the heart of fascism. Okay, let's bring this back to the specific story now of Italy. As we mentioned, proto-fascists in 1919 were looking for a national savior, someone who could rally the nation, someone who could bring into fruition these ideals and sentiments and make them practical and actionable and achievable. Initially, that man was not Benito Mussolini. Now, Mussolini was the son of a blacksmith and a Catholic school teacher, and he grew up in a socialist household that also celebrated Italian national heroes such as Garibaldi and Giuseppe Mazzini. If you go back and you listen to our podcast on the history of nationalism, in the 19th century, to say that you are a fan of Garibaldi is not to draw a distinction between nationalism and socialism, but they actually seem to fit quite well together at home in someone like a Garibaldi. I've read a couple of things about Mussolini's personality. Some of them kind of describe him as being gruff, as being a bully, as being kind of a jerk. It's hard to tell sometimes how accurate those things are versus projections backwards, right? Obviously, Mussolini becomes quite a jerk. He becomes quite uber masculine. How much of that was true as a young man, we're not exactly sure. But what we can say is that he was somewhat intellectually driven. He read Marx. He read other socialist literature. He would soon become active in socialist politics. So much so that actually in the early 1900s, he has to flee Italy because he's supposed to be joining the army. And he's like, I'm a good socialist. I don't join the army. And so he goes to Switzerland, where he runs into none other than Vladimir Lenin, who also happens to be in exile in Switzerland. In 1904, Mussolini returns to Italy during a period of amnesty, where he basically agrees to serve 2 years in the army. When he gets out, he becomes a journalist. He works for and later becomes the editor of a socialist newspaper, Avanti. This happens in 1912, right? So right on the eve of World War I, Mussolini is a pretty dyed-in-the-wool socialist. When the war comes, this is the event that will start to crystallize change in Mussolini's attitude. Most of the socialists in Italy do not like the idea of the war, but Mussolini celebrates it. He becomes what we would refer to as being an interventionist. He's someone that says, no, these great historical events are passing by. Italy cannot just maintain its neutrality, sit back on the sidelines, but it would be good for the nation to get involved, to fight. It would start to break up even some of these structures that we don't like in Italian society. So he would actually argue this is going to be good for socialism for World War I. Now, as this rift with the party grew, Mussolini actually gets himself expelled, and he'll found his own journal in November of 1914 called Il Popolo d'Italia, or the People of Italy. Right? So it still has that kind of socialist flavor to it. That populist flavor is something that we would describe it as today. In 1915, once Italy enters the war, Mussolini actually volunteers to rejoin the army, and he did see action on the Isonzo front later that year. Wounded in 1917, he then was discharged and returned towards editing his, again, very pro-war paper. So by the time you get towards the end of the war, Mussolini is not a nobody. But neither is he the focus of the nascent fascist movement. Instead, that honor would fall to the poet and writer Gabriele D'Annunzio. Born to a well-off family in 1863 on Italy's eastern coast, D'Annunzio was a bright student who became a successful, if controversial, author. He is also a very eccentric man. He would be perfect for today's sort of social media politics. He's the type of person that does stunts all the time, that has outrageous language, that draws a lot of attention to himself because he pushes cultural boundaries. One example of this is that D'Annunzio, this is kind of rare in history where you find somebody that takes this viewpoint, but D'Annunzio comes out and says, yeah, you know what, incest, if beauty is involved, if it's two beautiful people having incestuous relationships, that's okay. Most of us would say that's pretty crazy to say that, right? But he gets away with it because he says, well, we're going to justify it based on beauty. Won't surprise you to know that D'Annunzio is heavily masculine. He is a notorious womanizer. He's very irreverent about this too, and he actually keeps a sign over his bed that says, "Ne me frego," which translates to something like, I don't give a fuck. Now, we should also say that there's a sexual connotation to this, since frego means to rub. Now, this rebelliousness in his writings led to him having several of his works placed on the papal list of forbidden works, which you're living in Catholic Italy, you're an Italian writer. Making it onto the list of forbidden works is pretty noteworthy achievement. But D'Annunzio is not only interested in breaking boundaries, kind of culturally speaking, he is actually one of the first people to go on a flight with the Wright brothers. He comes back, and when World War I breaks out, he actually joins the Italian Air Force. At one point, he gets involved in politics. He's going to be elected in 1897 to the Italian Chamber of Deputies, not as a member of the right or the left, but as an independent, because he's just a guy that doesn't deal well with boundaries. In short, he's kind of a larger-than-life media star who openly admitted economics and day-to-day routine bored him. If you were around in 1999, if you followed politics, there was a kind of shocking moment when Jesse Ventura, a former wrestler, wins the governorship of Minnesota as an independent. I'm not calling Jesse Ventura a fascist, far from it, but this idea again of let's bring in somebody crazy, let's have a kind of media superstar, let's have someone who doesn't really care about the niceties of politics. This is kind of D'Annunzio's personality. After the war, D'Annunzio continued his activism in politics. One of the reasons that we noted that Italy had joined the Entente side was again this promise of territorial expansion, and we saw how at the Treaty of Saint-Germain, when Italy does not get the Dalmatian port city of Fiume, or modern-day Rijeka, we saw how disappointed and upset Italians were. D'Annunzio says, I am going to refuse to accept this slap in the face. I refuse to accept these ideas being foisted upon me by larger social and political forces. Instead, I am going to take direct action to achieve the Italy that I want to see. He actually organizes a group of about 2,000 Italian veterans, and together they seize the city by force. Now, negotiations will play out. Eventually, the Italians give up on the idea of including this. The Italian Navy actually bombards Rijeka very briefly, and the Yugoslavs, the kingdom of Croats, Slovenes, and Serbs, will actually come in and occupy this later on. But the attempt basically makes D'Annunzio a national superstar among the Italian nationalist community. He is, again, a man of action, a man who doesn't play by the rules, a man who does what's necessary to secure the national destiny. And so in many ways, his actions, one can argue, become a blueprint for fascism at the very moment that those fascist cells, those squadrists, are first coming together and forming. Now, again, at this point, Mussolini is kind of somewhat of a celebrity, but not a national celebrity. He's not on the same level, one could argue, as D'Annunzio. But he desires to become one. And so he starts pumping out again these passionate orations, these passionate writings, and it begins to win over more and more people. In particular, one of the challenges that the early fascist movement faces is because it's so organic, because it's so, hey, I'm going to get together with my buddies and create a cell, and we're not going to put up with this BS anymore. It tends to be a movement that's focused on the trees and has difficulty seeing the forest as a whole. And so that's really the reason that Mussolini becomes so popular. As an intellectual, as someone who's been thinking about and writing about Italian politics for a while, he has this kind of ability to talk about the larger issues involved, to see the bigger picture. And so he's able to articulate these values of the revolution in a succinct and effective way, and that wins the loyalty of some of these squadrists. Although I'll point out, too, their amount of loyalty varies. There are some that are very dedicated to Mussolini. There are some that see him as a vessel through which to achieve this larger goal. One of the few consistent things that Mussolini does in terms of ideology is he makes clear that he wants a national revolution, but one that is not based upon class, but that involves what they might call class collaboration. So the idea that social class is actually a good thing, it's out there, but it shouldn't be a source of friction. Rather, the classes should work together on behalf of the national good. At a famous speech in March 1919 at the Piazza San Sepolcro, for example, he says, quote, "We demand the right and proclaim the duty to transform Italian life, if it proves inevitable using revolutionary methods." This transformation was to bring together those who belong to the, quote, nation, the war, and the victory, end quote, in a sort of holy crusade for national glory. And of course, Mussolini's speech also included sharp denunciations of communists and socialists who he argued only served to divide and weaken the national community. But at the same time, when it came to policy, what's really fascinating about this is that he explicitly says we fascists are very flexible about what we mean by fascism. He wrote, for example, that fascists were for, quote, no a priori class struggle or for class cooperation. One or the other tactic may be adopted according to the circumstances, end quote. Later, he argues that fascism does not have a doctrine, and that it would only acquire a doctrine when, quote, it has time to elaborate and coordinate its ideas. We permit ourselves the luxury, he claimed, of being aristocrats and democrats, conservatives and progressives, those who follow legal processes and those who do not, according to the circumstances of place and surroundings, end quote. So again, one of the really key, fascinating things about this nascent fascist movement in the early 20s is that it doesn't see itself as conforming to traditional political labels. It is kind of trying to transcend them in the name of the national community. What matters is not whether you're right or left, but are you willing to bind into the fascist movement for the national revolution? Now, by the summer of 1920, these small fascist groups began to grow into a more powerful and coordinated movement, eventually joining an electoral bloc with more traditional parties. In November 1921, for example, Mussolini helps coordinate the founding of an official fascist political party, the Partito Nazionalista Fascismo, or the PNF. Now, he did have a political party kind of before this. This is kind of like version 2.0, but we don't want to get lost in some of the details there. It wasn't an official party, so this is kind of a new attempt to kind of make something more formal. Now, as conditions in Italy grew more polarized, the PNF began to grow, aided by support from wealthy landowners and businesses who feared communism. It even began to attract at least some level of support from more moderate Italian political figures, including eventually the king and the pope and the leaders of the army, and even a significant number of liberal Democrats who see Mussolini as something as a moderate fascist, someone that you can trust with the reins of power, but who won't carry out his own revolution. They therefore offered to partner with him in a coalition government, leading to his election to parliament in 1921. This is a theme that we'll come back to also in German history. This idea where the men that they see as the leaders of fascism, the thought process is they're really rational at heart. We can really negotiate with them at heart. We can control them to some extent at heart. And it's going to basically open the door to dictatorship. As we'll see in both Germany and Italy, dictatorship is not possible without the acquiescence of traditional conservatives, as well as members of the as well as some members of the more moderate parties, especially some of the Catholic parties. Now, Mussolini, of course, is not content to share power. Whether he was a bully as a kid, I'm not here to say, but what we can say is certainly by the time in the early 20s that he was becoming a political leader, he wanted all the power for himself. The same as will also be true for Hitler, as we'll see. If you don't like those two analogies, I'll throw out Napoleon Bonaparte as well. Napoleon Bonaparte, when he is originally brought in to be a part of the triumvirate, the idea is that he's going to be the face of the movement. He's just a general. What does he know? We can control him. We can subdue him. We can manipulate him. And of course, in Napoleon's case as well, it all goes badly. Over the course of about a year, Mussolini is getting kind of discussions. He's working himself into politics. And he starts to think, I need a revolution to overthrow the government or just to be named prime minister so that we can begin to implement a national revolution. Now, the catalyst that will move him along this path happens in August of 1922. There are a series of anti-fascist strikes. And Mussolini says, we can't allow this to continue. The government must punish these strikers. He says, if the government doesn't do it, we are fascists. We don't believe in the rule of law to the point that we would allow it to endanger ourselves. We believe in direct action. We believe at the end of the day, we have to make the situation right. So he says to the government, either you fix this problem or I will do it myself with my squadrists. The government does not act. And so, of course, then Mussolini does unleash his squadrists on some of these socialists all across Italy. The liberal government doesn't react to these efforts as well. They don't want to get involved. They're not going to repress the strikers. They're not going to prevent the repression. And so this convinces Mussolini that the Italian government is weak enough that it can be overthrown. They decide to organize in October of 1922 what is basically a reenactment of Italian history. Again, we haven't had time to go into all this. There was a guy named Giuseppe Garibaldi that we mentioned. He led this kind of march on Rome, this kind of popular army that was going to create Italy in and of itself. And that group in 1867 actually is defeated by the papal army outside Rome. Mussolini says, I am going to reenact this. This will be the March on Rome 2.0, but this time we will have success. And so he goes down to Naples and he rallies about 30,000 members of the movement who are known as the Black Shirts. And they start marching by foot on this massive procession towards Rome. You'll also see in this, of course, echoes of history, right? Echoes of social movements at various times. What do? They go to Rome, they petition the Pope, or they try to use these large numbers to kind of pressure him into reform. Now, faced with the threat of revolution, finally the Italian Prime Minister, Luigi Facta, decides, okay, let me try to act. I can't act directly because we have a constitutional monarchy. I will get the king to declare martial law, to declare an emergency. We'll deploy the army, and we'll put down Mussolini's rebellion. Incidentally, I left out, too, that Mussolini is, despite the fact that he goes down and gives this big speech to kind of get the movement going, he then gets on a train and goes back to Milan, and he bides his time and waits for this pressure to have its effect. And effect it has. On October 28th, Mussolini is named prime minister. The king basically says, do I want bloodshed? Do I want a revolution? Do I want to risk giving up my throne? No. If I make Mussolini the prime minister, then I don't have to worry about this question of whether or not he supports the kingdom. Soon after this, and we'll go into more detail in our next episode when we talk about Mussolini and power, he convinces the parliament, which actually has very few fascist deputies in it, he convinces them to award him dictatorial powers. Invested with these enormous powers, he then set about completing the first fascist revolution in history, eventually declaring a dictatorship in 1925. How he did that will be the subject of our next episode. But before we get there, let us just recap very briefly some of the major points from this episode. First, fascism emerged somewhat organically as both a reaction to communism, but also as a reaction to the weakness or perceived weakness of liberal democracy. Second, unlike communism, fascism was not overtly concerned with dogma or ideology. Instead, feeling, masculinity, this sense of togetherness and being part of a higher purpose, and the desire for action are what forms its key pillars. Third, fascists praised the idea of violence and rejected long-standing European taboos about its use as a means of solving social problems. Okay, we will leave it at that. Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you liked what you heard, please hit the subscribe or the like button, or simply tell others about the podcast. You can also find out more about us by checking out our website, www.historyoffthepage.com, which includes information about sources and recommendations for further reading. You can also support the show via Patreon, or as I mentioned, if you're on Spotify, they have a support the show button, so you just click that link at the bottom of the page, and that'll take you to Patreon, where you can support us for as little as $3 a month. You can also submit questions, as I mentioned, this way, and as I said, I'd be more than happy to answer any questions you might have. I know, again, with fascism, we tend to talk a lot about Germany. We don't talk as much about Italy, and so that's one of the reasons I decided to do this short series to begin with on the history of Italian fascism. Well, that's all for now. Have a great day, and hope to see you next time as we take history off the page.